Hi, and welcome back to the Rolling Hills Soul Care Podcast. My name's Jazzy. I'm here with Chuck. How are you doing today, Chuck?
Hi, Jazzy. I'm doing great. Thanks.
I love it. You're not just doing good. You're doing great.
Doing great.
That was very enthusiastic.
Yes.
So
And if we keep saying that.
if you keep saying it, you'll believe it.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to go back to Soul Care Post, your blog post number 94. Speaking of doing things, this is called Inactivity with a Purpose, yes?
Yes.
All
and
right.
that it just got my attention when Bill and Aaron were both teaching on this topic. So I'll just tell you what I wrote.
I love it.
A little over a year ago, I began a soul care blog post with these words. Hi, my name is Chuck, and I'm a doer. God gave me administrative gifts, and I love using those to get things done. I use checklists to remind me of what I need to do, and I get a strange feeling of satisfaction when I can cross an item off my list. But after listening to several of the Transformative Practices sermons, I started to wonder if I needed to put some new items on my list. Things not to do. During that teaching series, Aaron Dorr shared this helpful definition of spiritual practices. And this is his quote, repeated purposeful activity or inactivity of mind and body that we engage in by direct effort to bring our lives into effective participation and conformity with the life of Christ for the sake of His glory and the blessing of others. Purposeful inactivity. Bill Town called them rhythms of not doing, and that got my attention. What are some of these rhythms of not doing? Silence was one. Silence before God is a habit of not doing. I'm not doing noise. I'm not doing distractions. I'm not turning on music or the TV or any other thing that intrudes on the silence I need to hear God's voice. Instead, I can use this act of not doing as an act of worship. Fasting is a whole body practice of focusing on God as you don't eat. When I'm not eating, that makes me hungry. But I can use those hunger pangs to remind me to pray and ask God to help me to hunger for His presence as much as I do for food. Generosity requires that I don't spend money on some things in order to leverage the resources God has given me to invest in His kingdom work. I can choose to not spend so I have greater means to be generous to the things God has placed in front of me. Inactivity can't be the only thing we focus on, but it's one key ingredient in our work to be more like Jesus for the sake of His glory and the blessing of others. And that's worth adding to my checklist.
Chuck, this is really great, but really, really hard.
Yes, it is.
Because I share the checklist joy of like, oh, look at that thing. I got it all done, all those things.
Yeah, I actually have put things that I've already done on a checklist so I can check it.
I'll start my checklist. I'll make it in the middle of the day, but I will start it with the things that I did since I woke up so that I can say yes. And one of them is actually get out of bed. When I can check that off, I have done something right that day. But that, I mean... The whole idea, we've been talking about all these sacred rhythms and the rhythms of what we're doing, but like you said, the rhythms of not doing is almost not quite a slap to that, but it's just a completely different way of looking at it. Because I don't know about you, when I try to not do something, I find myself being distracted by what I am doing while I am not doing. So like while I'm trying for silence, my brain will be wandering and I will be probably thinking about the checklist or something like that. And if I'm fasting, I'm wondering about like, oh, what's this doing to my health or with my health, that kind of thing. I mean, just whatever the residual is of my inactivity, I struggle in focusing my brain and my heart on the result or the purpose of that. Sorry, not the result. I struggle to focus on the purpose of that inactivity.
Well, I think my guess is almost all of us do. I think
that's a relief.
Well, and I think that's part of it's on my mind as I write these and as we talk about them, is helping others to see that they're not alone. We're not alone. We all have issues. Let's just look at silence. We live in a noisy world, and we bring a lot of the noise in.
Very true.
And when I use the word noise, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a negative thing, but for some of us, it's a music or even white noise. Some people like a fan on, or the TV's on in the background. I've had friends who, if they're in the house, there is something on because otherwise the house feels too quiet.
I may be raising my hand right now.
Yeah, and while that may be helpful for some things, especially just, if you're doing housework and you just wanted that to be on, and there's nothing wrong with music, but if you're trying to sit silently to hear God's voice, you're going to do things that are kind of natural or normative to you, and if music is part of that for you, that can be where your brain goes immediately. It's quiet. Let's turn on some music. And for me, that even an instrumental song will often trigger the lyrics in my head, which means it's not helpful if I'm trying to hear God's voice. And that's why I think when we talk about the purposeful inactivity, that one, we choose to do it, and then two, we wrestle through the awkwardness of how that feels much of the time, and then just keep developing that practice, and it becomes a discipline, which may mean that I can only sit in silence for 5 minutes, and that just feels like an enormous period of time. But after doing it consistently, I can grow that until I can sit for longer periods of time. And it's not that longer is better. It's, can I sit long enough to hear what God is speaking to me? And are you going to have things while you're either being silent or you've decided, I'm going to not take a meal, but I'm going to, instead of eating, I'm going to spend this time in prayer. And instead you're thinking about either what you need to do or how hungry I am or what I'm going to have for dinner. And how do I turn that back to God and dedicating it to Him, saying, okay, Lord, help me in this practice, and recognize that we're human. We've shared in a previous podcast, those things that jump into your head about things to do. Again, those aren't bad, they aren't wrong, but they're distractions in the moment. And so having a piece of paper and a pen nearby so you can write that down and put it aside again to refocus and be gentle to ourselves, because I think God knows exactly how we're wired, and He's just pleased that we've chosen to do this thing. So those first two are silence and fasting, are just examples of things of not doing in order to draw closer to God. The third one was not spending in order to think about how can I use my resources for God, and being not just alert to them, but actually able to act on those things. And again, that's a type of discipline, and that does not mean we deprive ourselves of every single thing, but that we're thoughtful, mindful of those things.
So I feel like I remember a few weeks ago, maybe in a gathering, the teacher giving us a 5-minute silence break. And I remember really appreciating the way that they introduced it. They said, we're going to spend 5 minutes of silence, and the first 3 minutes are going to be the most awkward thing you've ever experienced. And then by minutes 4 and 5, it's going to be kind of cool, because your brain will have started to adjust, and you're starting to attune to what God wants you to hear. And it feels like that's kind of what you're saying, is like not necessarily being amazing at this practice or the inactivity practice, right? But just dedicating that time and being willing to write it out and wait and see what that particular inactivity God will speak through, or what God has to say through that particular inactivity.
Yeah, sticking it out, being willing to recognize, okay, maybe this isn't a good spot for me to be silent in, and go someplace else, or at least recognize next time I'm not going to do that. For me, sitting in the house is harder for me to be silent than it is outside for some reason. And so just finding those, what works for you. But I was sitting in a room full of people and asked to be silent and have nothing happening for 5 minutes. It's interesting how awkward it feels. It can feel, there can be awkward if there's silence for even 30 seconds in what is normally things are happening rapidly through a service. A gap causes you to think something's wrong, and I think we're wired that way. Something must be wrong. Well, not when we're intentionally silent.
Okay.
And that silence, to me, and this isn't just me, but that silence is an opportunity in a conversation with God to stop talking on my part. And I've been talking. All right, Lord, what do you have to say to me? And so giving him the opportunity to talk. He's talking all the time.
But are we listening?
Are we listening?
Yes. That is a lot to think about. Now I feel like I need to go sit quietly and maybe skip lunch and sit quietly at the same time. Yeah, thank you, Chuck. That is a lot to think about and process. And I will be doing that this week. If you would like to read more of our blog posts and the wisdom that Chuck has imparted there, you can find all of these posts, past and present and future, at rollinghills.org/worship. You can also follow RH Worship on Instagram. There's a link to the blogs there, and you can subscribe to this podcast feed where you will find more soul care podcasts and our Sunday teachings as well. Meantime, thank you, Chuck.
It's fun to be here with you, Jossie. Thank you.
It's so great to be here. I love this. We will talk to you all again in a couple weeks.